Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a real paradigm shift. We're going to look at why having all the scientific facts, the hard data, and the precise measurements about our decaying environment just isn't enough to save it. So what actually is? Let's get into it.
It's the absolute elephant in the room, right? If we know exactly how to fix the environment, why is it only getting worse? We have decades of scientific data on everything from climate change to biodiversity loss. Scientists have understood the basic greenhouse gas effect since the late 19th century. We know exactly what burning fossil fuels does, and we know the exact impact of cutting down old-growth forests. And yet, global environmental degradation just seems to accelerate. So why the huge disconnect? Well, this brings us to the core of what we're talking about today, ecopolitics. It's essentially the study of the relationship between political systems and the natural environment. Think of the environment like a giant, wildly complex chessboard. The ecosystems are the squares, sure, but politics, meaning human power, laws, and institutions, those are the hands actually moving the pieces. The environment isn't just about trees and oceans. It's directly tied to how governments make binding decisions that dictate the future of our whole society. Think about the stark contrast here. On one side, we have environmental science. It acts like a microscope. It brilliantly tells us what is physically happening to our planet and how ecosystems actually work. But on the flip side, ecopolitics acts a bit more like a gavel. It asks the really hard, honestly uncomfortable questions. Who decides how natural resources are used? Why do these massive conflicts even arise in the first place? And maybe most importantly, who actually benefits financially and who bears the heavy costs of these decisions?
So the whole dynamic really boils down to this. Science tells us what's happening and what we should do, but politics and governance entirely dictate whether those solutions ever see the light of day. Science gives us the blueprint for survival, but without the political will and the right institutions backing it up, that blueprint literally just sits on a shelf collecting dust. It's kind of a tragedy, having all the answers but lacking the political engine to actually drive them forward.
But what does this actually look like in the real world? Let's ground this abstract idea by zooming in on the Philippines. It's a fascinating nation to look at because it offers this stark, really surprising contrast. On one hand, it ranks as one of the most mega biodiverse countries on the entire planet, just teeming with unique species and rich resources. But on the other hand, it's consistently ranked as one of the absolutely most vulnerable nations to the impacts of climate change and extreme weather.
When you analyze the major environmental crises in the Philippines, and we're talking rapid deforestation, illegal logging, all the way to flooding and marine degradation, a pretty striking pattern emerges. The root causes of these 9 major issues, they aren't scientific mysteries. We know exactly why a stripped forest causes a landslide. The real issues are human failures, weak enforcement, poor urban planning, deep-rooted corruption, and competing economic interests. These are fundamentally governance failures. The science is solved, but the management is completely broken.
Let's get even more specific and look at a few tangible examples. Take the Tampacon copper-gold project in Mindanao. It's one of the largest undeveloped copper-gold deposits in the world, but it sits smack in the middle of ancestral domains, sparking these intense, decades-long conflicts between economic growth and indigenous rights. Or look at Manila Bay, a beautiful, historic body of water that's now just choking under massive amounts of plastic waste from unregulated industries. And in Metro Manila, millions deal with the bizarre irony of severe water scarcity during the dry season, followed immediately by devastating flooding during the monsoon. The underlying story for all of these is exactly the same. The root causes consistently trace back to weak law enforcement, a lack of accountability, and totally conflicting political priorities. This naturally leads us to a highly frustrating paradox. Why do these environmental laws fail when the legal provisions are actually so strong? The Philippines actually has some incredibly comprehensive laws on the books. Take the Clean Air Act or the Climate Change Act. These are genuinely solid, world-class pieces of legislation. So where's the disconnect? Why does the actual implementation so frequently fall short of the paper it's printed on?
To figure out this gap, political scientists break ecopolitics down into a really helpful framework. This framework basically dictates how policies translate into action, or, well, why they fail to. It starts at policymaking and public administration, expands outward to broader governance and political participation, and then ultimately reaches all the way up to international agreements. Let's walk through exactly how these steps play out in reality.
It all starts right here with public administration. This means looking at the actual day-to-day bureaucratic capacity and accountability of government agencies, like the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or DNR, and the local government units. Imagine being tasked with protecting millions of acres of vulnerable rainforest or policing thousands of miles of coastline, but you're handed a tiny budget, outdated equipment, and practically no staff. Do these agencies have the actual resources, manpower, and integrity to execute the law? That is the harsh reality of public administration in action.
But here is a really vital distinction we have to make. True governance is way broader than just the government. Solving massive environmental problems simply can't be done by government agencies acting alone in a silo. Managing resources requires real, active cooperation. For instance, successfully managing a protected watershed often relies heavily on local indigenous peoples who have generational knowledge of the land, partnering right alongside environmental NGOs and local communities. It's this massive collective effort, where sometimes these groups collaborate perfectly, and other times they clash bitterly.
And this is exactly where the role of the citizen comes in. Active political participation, whether that's voting in local elections, showing up to public consultations, community organizing, or even peaceful protests and citizen monitoring, this is what actually forces accountability. When local communities show up in huge numbers to a public hearing about a proposed coal plant or a new mining project, they're directly shaping the environment they live in. They are making absolutely sure their leaders know they're being watched.
As we look at how these different groups interact and advocate for themselves, we hit a really critical ethical dilemma. Who should bear the environmental costs of economic development? Imagine a hypothetical mining project. Should it get the green light if it generates 1,000 much-needed local jobs and millions in tax revenue, but it completely destroys the watershed that downstream farmers rely on for their crops? This isn't just a simple environmental question anymore. It is deeply political and deeply ethical. It involves justice, survival, and pure power.
Which brings us to the powerful demand of environmental justice. This is the principle that environmental benefits and burdens should be shared fairly among all people, regardless of income, ethnicity, or social status. Environmental justice demands that marginalized groups, like indigenous communities facing displacement or the loss of their ancestral lands, don't disproportionately bear the toxic runoff and the negative impacts, while large, faraway corporations reap all the massive economic profits. Essentially, it's about making sure the poorest among us don't end up paying the highest price for progress. So, what is the end goal of navigating all these intense politics and justice issues? It's sustainable development. This means development that meets our present needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. Now, I know sustainability gets thrown around as a corporate buzzword all the time, but in reality, it's the ultimate tightrope walk. It is an incredibly delicate, highly difficult balancing act between driving economic growth, ensuring social equity, and relentlessly protecting the earth we're standing on. And of course, none of this is happening in a vacuum. Crises like climate change and biodiversity loss completely transcend national borders, which means there is a massive global context to all of this. The Philippines actively participates in major international agreements like the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. But they aren't just showing up to sign papers, they're literally fighting for survival. As a highly vulnerable nation, they have to advocate fiercely on the global stage to get heavy polluting nations to reduce emissions before rising seas swallow their coastlines.
But back at home, balancing those global commitments with local economic realities forces us to confront this central puzzle. Can economic development and environmental protection truly coexist? Can we build infrastructure, create jobs, and pull people out of poverty without destroying our home in the exact same breath? It often feels like an impossible equation. But it's exactly the equation that ecopolitics forces us to solve if we want any kind of viable future.
The 1987 Philippine Constitution anchors this entire debate with an incredibly powerful mandate. Article 2, Section 16 explicitly says, "The state shall protect and advance the right of the people to a balanced and healthful ecology." Now, this is huge. It elevates environmental protection from a mere policy preference or some nice-to-have government program and turns it into a fundamental, undeniable human right, sitting right on par with the right to liberty. So as you look at the reality of deforestation, seasonal flooding, and the pollution around us, I want to leave you with this. Is this constitutional promise actually being kept, or is it going to require every ounce of our political will, our active participation, and our voices to finally secure the environment we deserve? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep asking the hard questions.